And so a tension or dichotomy that I was exploring in the book for sure was, do you structure your decisions based on universalist morality or relationship-based morality? And at some point you get to the point where the other side of the trolley has just such a high body count that no matter how much you're on the kind of familial relationship based, you gotta kind of pause and like, okay, where do I shift the trolley? There is no correct answer. The reason the trolley problem is interesting is that there is no correct answer, but the questions are still worthwhile. I think there are lots of questions that don't have answers that are still really worthwhile to ask.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between or beyond. Today I'm back with part 2 of the interview with Alexander Boldizar, where we're talking about his book, The Man Who Saw Seconds. Welcome back, Alexander.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So this time we'll actually get into the book. We did sort of skirt around it last time, but a lot of interesting stuff to discuss involving the writing and your own backstory as well. So I guess I'll give a sort of brief introduction, then I wanted to sort of turn it over to you for a little bit. So the main character, the interesting idea about this book is that the main character has a 5-second window where he can view possibilities and, in fact, select from possibilities. You mentioned throughout the book Laplace's demon quite a bit, which sort of frames the overall maybe theme or idea of the book. I wonder if you could just sort of maybe start there by explaining to listeners what that would be.
Well, Laplace's demon was this conceptual exercise by Laplace, who postulated a demon, an omniscient demon who knew the location of every atom in the universe and its vector, and so he could predict the future with kind of infinite knowledge as to where things, if two billiard balls bounce and you have infinitely accurate information as to the angles, you're going to know where they keep bouncing. And came across this analysis of Laplace's demon at one point that I found fascinating. There was this idea that the amount of information in the universe is so high that if you calculated in order to calculate every vector in the universe and every molecule in the universe, if your calculation speed was the speed of light and the gap was the Planck length, which is the minimum gap basically for two molecules to be or atoms to be distinct. I'm very simplifying here, but basically it would take more than the 15 billion years of the universe since the Big Bang to calculate the location of every atom in the universe. So there's just basically too much information in the universe to calculate in 15 billion years if you're calculating by the speed of light. And to me, that seemed to disprove the concept of omniscience. So every God across religions basically is omniscient. I mean, they differ in whether they're omnipotent, they differ in like how benevolent they are, how much they interact, but they're always omniscient. And so, I mean, obviously, this shouldn't mess with people's religious beliefs because God presumably wouldn't be limited to the speed of light in his calculations. But given what we know of physics, omniscience is impossible based on this kind of extrapolation of Laplace's demon. And this was an idea that I grabbed onto about 20 years ago, but it always fascinated me with the ability to, how far prediction would be possible. You could calculate a few steps out because as the information kind of gets exponentially more complex, you start getting into too many calculations where you can't keep up. So that was long before I wrote this book. It was kind of an early fascination with the concept of prediction. I like using Laplace's demon because it simplified the idea of knowing how things will, like how the billiard balls will bounce. And it had the word demon in it, which touched on the moral ambiguity within the book as Preble gets more and more extreme in his behavior to do kind of the most fundamentally good thing you can imagine, which is protect his family, protect his son. He gets more and more extreme to where, in the eyes of a lot of society, he would become a demon, basically. And so it captured very efficiently both his slim superpower and the moral ambiguity of the main character. And so it's just a really convenient trope.
Do you think that still applies given quantum theory and quantum computers out of curiosity? I mean, it's an aside from the book, but I'm just curious.
Well, the book actually goes into the kind of Feynman's quantum theory as an alternative, like, to, because Laplace, yeah, that was all before quantum theory. I think quantum theory comes to the same impossibility conclusion through a different path. If every path of every atom is probabilistic, you're going to have some extremely low probability path that will generate error terms to your calculations. And again, because those paths are extremely low probability, it takes a while before they aggregate to actually changing macro movements and macro elements, but they do aggregate as they get more and more of them. And so I think quantum theory will also come to the same conclusion that maybe you could see a little bit into the future, but it will be heavily bounded how far you could, because those probability errors would aggregate. So I'm not a scientist, and I didn't want to necessarily create a straight explanation of how this skill is possible, because it's counterfactual. Nobody can see 5 seconds into the future.
Right.
But I wanted to frame the debate by people who were fighting against Preble as they try to analyze. Any military will try to analyze the nature of the opponent's most effective weapon. And so when the government is trying to analyze what Preble's weaknesses are, they go through several possible explanations, trying to understand what the nature of a skill is in order to counter it. And I just thought that was really interesting to make it as realistic as feasible, given that I'm trying to prove something that's actually not possible to do.
Right. Yeah. I guess I was kind of wondering with quantum computing, for example, is the limitation still there on the amount of information that we could process? But that perhaps isn't relevant. It was just curiosity. But I
The-
do,
the-
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just, because when you're talking about quantum computing, I had in one of my readings, I had a physicist in the audience, and he asked me whether Preble's skill was in the nature similar to quantum superposition, which it's not established until after. In a sense, you don't know which position something will fall into until after it happens.
Hmm.
Because in a sense, Preble is not just seeing the future; he's able to see all the probabilities and kind of rewind. And I guess in a sense, there are some parallels to quantum superposition on a kind of macro scale, where you don't know where it was until after it's played out, but he can kind of rewind that. So there are quantum elements, but my understanding of quantum is not strong enough to really have an articulate conversation on it. So I did want to present that line of explanation, but I don't want to get myself into trouble by saying really stupid things. My son is studying quantum physics right now, so I should have him.
Yeah, we'll get go ask him. Yeah. No, I hadn't thought of the superposition idea, but I can see how a physicist might come up with that explanation. I'm doing some world building for a large saga. And as part of that, I'm kind of exploring the idea that, like you hinted at in your story and various times, that all time exists simultaneously, in which case I would see Preble as, and the way I read it was that he's selecting the path. And I do like the way you described it, because it feels like if this is possible, let's say, if it was possible, then what I would view it as is a very natural way to do it. You look where you want to be and you select the path that gets you there rather than sorting through all the infinite possibilities on which one's the best. You just say, I want to be there, and it's all taken care of sort of under the hood, as it were. So
Yeah.
I do really like the way that was described.
In a sense, it's like smearing. Right now our present is infinitely thin, and so Preble's present is not infinitely thin. It's 5 seconds thick, and so within that 5 seconds, he can treat, like you said, you can select the future, the very near future that works best for him, and work backwards. So that's why he can, figure out codes to a lock, for example, because he doesn't have to play with a million different variations in his head. He just experiences the future where his random set of numbers actually works, and then that's what he punches in. So that makes his slim superpower more multifaceted, it can do a lot more that way. It was a really interesting exercise to write a character who had this way of seeing the world. One of the best things about fiction in my mind is that, unlike almost any other art form, you enter into another character. In almost every other art form, you're seeing from the outside, but in fiction is the only art form where you actually enter the worldview, the morality, the framework of another person. I think that's very valuable during a polarized political time. But in this case, it wasn't, entering a different morality. It was entering a completely alien way of seeing the world. And so there's one scene where he loses his ability because the emotional element is kind of overwhelming. And so for him, it was fun seeing how somebody like him, like Preble, would see our way of experiencing reality. And it felt very jagged to him. So to him, the present is smooth, smeared out, whereas to us, everything feels jagged because it's infinitely thin. And so these kinds of thought experiments to me are a really fun aspect of writing, just seeing the world through a completely alien. I haven't written a science fiction book with an alien species, but I think that would be really fun as well. Just a mental exercise of it.
That's another issue with aliens. The problem with aliens is you have to still frame it in something that humans can understand, don't you? So it's very
Yeah.
difficult to get something truly alien. But it's interesting, as you mentioned, with his experience with our reality. Let's say it kind of reminds me of a little bit of the way computers will do artwork, for example, like the digital versus anti-aliased, right? So his is a bit smeared out. So as you say, you describe it as everything's smoother. It's kind of the similar way if a computer draws a diagonal line, or really jaggedy, but then it does the anti-aliasing with it, put this kind of smearing the colors along the side, and you get something that actually looks like a sharper line than the original would have without the smearing, even though the
Oh,
first one's
interesting.
sharper. So, I mean, maybe I didn't describe that very well, but anyone who does digital art will know.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it's kind of strange that, and this calls back into something which I find interesting and was briefly discussed at the end of the Avengers Age of Ultron movie. So you got Vision talking to Ultron, and he says humans are a strange species and that they think that chaos and order are two different things. It's really interesting when you sort of try to find the boundary between them and you find that they overlap a lot and you need chaos to get the appearance of more order. But if you just get strict order, you almost have a destructive force in a way. Same one, chaos is obvious, but I just find that balance very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's the yin yang, right?
Yeah, exactly,
There's a
exactly.
yin within the yang and the yang within the yin.
Yeah, and the more you try to separate them, the more you realize you can't actually separate them because they're embedded within
Yeah.
each other. Yeah. So Preble, he has what's interesting is, and the further he goes through the story without giving spoilers, is that so he has this expanded time awareness, but he seems to have a fairly narrow, let's say, I don't know, social awareness maybe, which in some ways gets narrower and narrower, more focused on him and his family, let's say, to a degree as his power grows even. So that's an interesting balance. Was that something you put in intentionally, or was it just something that grew organically from the way the character progressed?
It, well, in part it grew organically, but in part it was an important thematic role in the kind of, as he became more and more obsessed with saving his family, everything else kind of fell out off by the wayside. Something I've seen a lot in life where anything with a zero tolerance approach, like say again, risking political third rails, but are the COVID lockdowns where only thing we focused on was COVID, and suddenly cancer diagnoses went up, mental health issues went up. I find that anytime you take a zero tolerance approach to one threat, other threats go up. And I think that's part of this whole thing that we talked about in the first podcast about institutions working against their own purposes. The extreme obsession with any or extremely narrow focus ends up causing all kinds of collateral damage. And in a way, I want to keep it complex because I can't find anything that I would emotionally sympathize with more than a father protecting his son. To me, on an emotional level, there's nothing more powerful or emotionally more important than protecting my son. So I want to take something that I fundamentally agree with as strongly as possible and still find potential negative consequences out of it on an intellectual level. And so his narrowing is definitely an important part of the arc of like, does he become a monster? So you decide. But I don't think I thought of it in terms of his power expanding, because his power is still roughly 5 seconds. It's shrunken when he's very emotional, and he's getting colder and colder as he's kind of getting more and more obsessed with his one focus. So I was conscious of maintaining those tensions, but I don't think I explicitly made them go in opposite directions.
One thing that was interesting to me is how certain assumptions can govern our lives to disastrous consequences in some cases. And obviously, so you did take this to a bit of an extreme with Preble without saying any more. But is that something that you think about occasionally? Because he made some assumptions, and well, I don't want to go too much more detail into that, but they govern the direction of the plot that and his actions. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Is that something else you think about much, or again, is that something that evolves itself from the plot, essentially, in the direction you want to
Um,
take the story?
well, I'm not 100% sure which assumptions you're talking about, but I think that's just a flip side of the same idea that he gets more and more closed off.
Yeah. So
There's an irony in that he can see the future in 5 seconds, but he's very bad at planning long term. I think I say it at one point in the book that doesn't mean he plans ahead in the grown-up sense of the word. So as he becomes obsessive, he's in a sense not able to plan in any kind of long-term mature way. He's just obsessed with his mission, and that kind of comes across as assumptions in a way.
yeah, I guess he made an assumption with the event that happened when they were up north that led to the plot, which was resolved at the end, let's say with the final chapter.
Yeah, well, I think I tried to keep it that he really didn't know what happened, and he thought he could squeeze the information out of the government. And so I mean, there's an assumption in terms of he was certain that he could get the answer if he just applied enough pressure, just as the government was certain that if they applied enough pressure on him, he'd cave. And so they were both kind of, even though the book is very much a individual against social construct, social system kind of institutions, the three-letter agencies and all that, it is man against world kind of novel. At the same time, there's a mirroring of tactics that they're using in order to force each other to comply with their wishes, and that's what generates that constant escalation, which clearly becomes counterproductive by the end of the book for everyone.
Right, right. I guess I just was just thinking we didn't really give the listeners any of the sort of vision of the start of the story. So I guess that's not really a spoiler because that's all in the look inside and everything. So if you don't mind, so essentially what happens is he's basically on the subway in a little bit of a bad mood and gets approached by, I think you mentioned in the first podcast you had the experience of some corrupt police officers that evolved through the system, and that kicks off a set of events that leads to one of their deaths and then sets off everything else because obviously if you kill a police officer even accidentally you're going to be in trouble. And so then it sets off a chain of events just to give, and he uses his 5 second abilities in this regard, and that's sort of the shortest summary maybe I can give to give the listener a sort of view of how this whole starts off and sort of a bit of a perspective of what we're talking about.
Can I say one thing? One
Yes,
thing there.
definitely.
I didn't want to make it that the police officers were corrupt. I actually have a lot of police friends, and so I wanted to be very clear about the distinction between the police as an institution versus the police as individuals. So
Mm.
even in the inciting incident, I had to choose a poor example of a police officer, but he himself was kind of tired, grumpy, had a bunch of things going on, and he overreacted. Preble overreacted. It was kind of I want to create a spiral, but I didn't want it to be rooted in this idea of the police are bad or anything like that. I want to be very careful with this distinction between the police as an institution and the police as individuals. Like one of the most redeeming characters in the book is Captain Crumb, the police captain. And even the police in the subway, obviously you need an inciting incident. You need things to go wrong in order to kind of start this whole cascade. But I wanted the inciting incident to be as small as I could possibly make it in order to start small and have it grow very big. And that it's actually built into the name. Like, people have asked me, well, why it's such a strange name, Preble. And there are a couple of 3 elements within it that are kind of packed into that little name. Preble is a PRE, it starts with a PRE, so like precognition. Then there's rebel, spelled differently, but rebel as in the sense of he's fighting against society. But there's also the word pebble. And so that was inspired kind of the Muhammad Ali quote that it's not the mountains ahead to climb that are the problem. It's not the mountains ahead, but the pebble in your shoe. That's the problem. And so, in a sense, Preble becomes the pebble in society's shoe. You commented on the boulders behind me in my office. My first book was about a boulder throwing mountain man, and so I thought it would be kind of funny Easter egg element that I'm moving from giant boulders to a little pebble in society's shoe. So that's why I wanted to make the inciting incident as something as silly as taking up 2 seats on the subway. Like, let's find the most ridiculous thing to clash about and see how far I can escalate it.
Right. That itself is interesting as well, isn't it? Because too often, unfortunately, humans the way we are, you just get two people who happen to be in a bad mood one day with differing approaches to what they want to happen, and you got a conflict, right? And it doesn't even have to be about anything important, like you say, the inciting incident. So that's really an interesting and an unfortunate aspect, perhaps, of human nature.
I had a female writer friend who, when she blurbed the book, said it's about how male decision cycles can escalate. And while I never thought it was a particularly male thing, I think humans can get caught up in these decision cycles that can cause us a lot of problems. And the whole idea of decision cycles is very much built into the book. I mean, everything from seeing the future in your decision cycles to this idea that you just talked about how we as humans can get caught up in these things without seeing the long-term consequences.
Yeah. I'd want a couple other things. Well, I got a lot of other things I'd like to ask you, but I wanted to just take a brief diversion to ask you about chess boxing, because this was the first time I've ever heard of it, but I did look it up and it's a real thing. So, do you chess box, or did you just look up something that would fit the character for what you needed in the story?
I don't chess box. I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I teach it. I'm a black belt, but it's not very adaptable to this plot. What I like about chess boxing is it kind of conceptually, I've always been both very physical, but also kind of, I've always had the two sides. Like, I love chess and I love combat sports. Just a combat sports, not boxing. But for Preble's skill set, boxing was far more fitting than Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So yeah, it's taking off something that I'm interested in and trying to find something that will fit the character more.
Right.
But the idea, the idea appeals to me. I've always liked the kind of juxtaposition of opposites, and to put that together into one sport, I just think it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. I do like the idea of a sport that has the physical and the academic. I mean, a lot of sports do have strategy, but I like the mixing of that sort of academic and physical. And there was a show in the 90s, I think, called Sliders. I don't know if you ever saw it. They basically slid between different dimensions, different Earths, and things like that. And they did come to one version of Earth that had a sport like that, which they had to answer questions as they tossed a ball around what was effectively a human-sized chessboard, effectively. And so capture squares on the board. It was an interesting idea. Unfortunately, no one's ever taken it on yet, but I thought that was
I
cool.
remember the show, but I don't remember that episode.
It stuck with me because I like that idea.
Yeah, I just don't want to get punched in the head. Too many concessions.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of hamper your chess playing after
Yeah.
that. I was thinking as the story went on, especially due to comments of, let's say, the antagonist, that it made me think of Asimov's Mule as well. So he was quite concerned with. So I don't know if you know, if you remember the Mule in the Foundation series. I call it Asimov's Mule here. Let's go with Laplace's demon. But in the Foundation series, there was the Mule who turned out to be a mutation, effectively, that messed up the calculations for the restoration of the society. What I was thinking is just that he was concerned that Preble was going to be basically that mutation that takes down society effectively. the
Yeah.
one that you can't control. And that's kind of what the mule was in a way, the one outside of the boundaries of the structure. So it made me think of that anyway.
Oh, interesting. I
Um,
mean,
so
that's the source of Big Man's obsession.
yeah, that was an interesting name you chose for him as well.
I struggled with that a little bit because I initially wanted him to be fighting against the system or our systems or systemic kind of, as our society gets more and more complex, deep in terms of layers of complexity, it takes on, like, systems take on a life of their own. And so a big theme in the book is this idea of systems taking on a life of their own and becoming like steamrollers that nothing can stop. Like nobody's driving them anymore. And I wanted to have that be the antagonist, but you can't write a book. Like you need to anthropomorphize that in some way. So Big Man was the anthropomorphization of a system that's protecting itself, like an immune system or and then like an immune, disease. It can get hyperactive. It can get to the point where it's causing all the harm. By choosing the name Big Man, it's almost ironic because it's not supposed to be just one guy. It's not supposed to be one bad actor. It is supposed to be a personification or an anthropomorphization of the entire system working to protect itself against this irritant or the mule, as you said.
I would say that as the story develops, you do bring in more of the system around Big Man, let's say. So you do get that impression that it is the system rather than one actor, definitely. So I mean, any superhero has got to have his foils, I suppose.
Yeah.
um, I guess there's two I would think of in this case that come to mind, and one is the butterfly effect. So kind of like what we are describing with the story, where it starts small and then the ripples sort of grow and grow into larger and larger effects. And then the other one that's interesting, and I think you brought in, you must have brought it in purposefully because it happened over and over again, and that would be the trolley problem. So if you have a character that can see into the future, even if it's 5 seconds, he can sort of guide his decisions. But just for the listeners who aren't aware, the trolley problem is basically, you can't save everyone. So you have a train coming on a track that's going to hit 5 people, and you have the option to pull a switch that'll turn it onto a different track where it only hits one person. Someone's going to die either way. And he's kind of faced with this throughout, and he makes very consciously, well, maybe not consciously, maybe very emotionally, I don't know, decisions at certain points. But it is an interesting foil for a character that can see into the future, with let's say no-win scenarios in some extent. And so first of all, I guess, was it consciously built into the story? Obviously, yeah.
It was, but not, I didn't conceptualize it as the trolley problem, but
Okay.
it's an excellent way of looking at his kind of his own moral decisions. At the beginning, he starts off trying to not hurt anyone, and he's doing everything he can to make sure nobody's hurt at least, and then it becomes that nobody's hurt through an action, only through omission, and then gradually he gets more and more pulled in, as all the paths through the trolleys have dead bodies underneath them. And in terms of facing the trolley problem, one thing that was explicitly on my mind is, are you familiar with the concept of weird countries, the
Of
Western educated? So there's this concept of the weird countries are the Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
okay.
So basically Western Europe, and there's a significantly different morality in weird versus non-weird countries. And Eastern Europe is, even though it's Europe, it's generally considered not weird. And because I was born in Czechoslovakia, but I lived most of my life in North America, I'm kind of familiar with both mindsets. And the morality within, say, Eastern Europe and much of the rest of the world is very relationship based. So a trolley problem in Indonesia or in Slovakia would be an obvious answer. Like if your son is on one of those train tracks, then you're going to make the trolley go on the other train track, even if it's got 10 times as many people.
Right.
So I think it's the weird countries have a much more universalist morality. I still think when push comes to shove, people will prioritize their own family over a stranger. But we have this moral concept that's an emotional rather than a rational decision. Whereas if you talk to somebody from Indonesia or Slovakia, they'd be like, no, of course it's rational to choose your family. And so that was a tension or dichotomy that I was exploring in the book for sure. Was like, do you structure your decisions based on universalist morality or relationship based morality? And I mean, I don't think it's a spoiler that Preble prioritizes his family with massive consequences. And at some point, you get to the point where the other side of the trolley has just such a high body count that no matter how much you're on the kind of familial relationship based, you gotta kind of pause and like, okay, at what point does it
Yeah,
become, where do I shift the trolley? There is no correct answer. Like the
yeah,
trolley problem,
exactly.
the reason the trolley problem is interesting is that there is no correct answer, but the questions is still worthwhile. I think there are lots of questions that don't have answers that are still really worthwhile to ask, and that's kind of
Yeah,
what I was trying to do.
I think it's interesting in the West that it usually gets expressed as intentionality in a way, isn't it? It's like you either let people die by inaction or you kill someone, a smaller number of people by your action. And that's where most people get hung up. But it's interesting that what you said with the rest of the world, it's much more sort of genetic lineage that ties you to the sort of the answer.
And not just genetic, but concentric circles. Like you'll prioritize your friends over somebody you've never met.
Right.
But the act omission distinction is also built in. So that you're right. But the trolley problem, there's an intentionality element, and Preble is trying to follow that initially, where he knows that he's just dodging bullets, but he knows that, okay, I'm going to dodge it. It's going to miss me, but it's going to hit somebody else. Um, but that's better than it hitting me. So am I still morally, if he's only dodging, is he still morally responsible for that bullet hitting the officer? I've never been a fan of the act omission distinction. I think within the law you have to have it for certain practical reasons, but I think if you don't do anything, you could still be morally responsible for. I mean, again, they're interesting questions, and Preble has to kind of deal with them at each stage. So it's a trolley problem that keeps repeating and keeps growing in numbers, I guess.
Yeah, no, it was interesting to watch the change in his character, let's say, as the balance changed on the trolleys.
Yeah.
Because he did, like you say, he started like as an incredibly moral character, and even the one accidental death in the first sequence bothered him, and he put the blame on himself. But then he did have the sort of the circle that he was concerned with, and then yeah, things happen.
And I think that actually happens in real life. Like I've traveled a lot, and the scariest places to travel are countries that have just gone through a war or a civil war, because taking life becomes easier. And it's something that we don't really experience that much in the West. But countries, like if my son were traveling now, I'd be most scared of him. Obviously, I wouldn't want him to go to the war zone, but even a country immediately after a war, I'd be scared if you were traveling there, purely because the taboo against taking life seems to get weakened as people go through horrible situations like wars, where once you've killed a bunch of people, killing one more doesn't have the same moral weight, as horrible as that is to articulate. But I mean, I've definitely traveled in Africa and countries that have just gone through a civil war, and I've been scared. And so I do think that's something that's realistic, even though we try to avoid thinking about it
Yeah,
as a society.
I think in the West, in some ways, it's not there yet. I mean, like I said, I can appreciate how frightening that would be because there is sort of an immediacy to that. In the West, I think we're on a path kind of slowly. I don't know, frog boiling people say a lot of times, but we're building up this anger and tribalism. Like it's just a earlier stage on that pathway. Once you get comfortable at releasing your anger and then it turns to hatred against, that sounds like Star Wars, but it turns to hatred against the other side, it becomes easier and easier and they become the villain, then they become demons, and then you feel justified in destroying them basically. Unfortunately, we're on that path in the West as well.
No, I agree, and I've had the book compared to Doctor Strangelove, and there's definitely a satirical component to the entire novel. Like it's written as a science fiction thriller, but it's also a satire. It's just satire that I wanted to keep so subtle that it wasn't obvious that it's satire. It's like right on that borderline where you can ask, is this satire or not? And I definitely wanted to walk that line where it was not obviously satire or obviously, straight thriller.
So do you have a sequel plan for this? The end does kind of suggest a possibility, but doesn't require it.
I don't have a sequel plan for this yet. I've had a lot of readers ask for a sequel, and I've been playing with ways to make that work. I don't want to basically repeat the same book, obviously. So right now I have a couple of books in the works, but they're completely different. I have been playing with the possibilities of how I could structure a sequel, but nothing on paper yet, just in the back of my head.
Well, I guess as we're almost out of time, I wanted to ask you sort of one more a big question. Not that anything else wasn't a big question. It's just the category I have at the end of the show. Now, I would have liked to delve much more into political structures because that is a discussion that happens within the book, especially with your anarchist lawyer a fair amount, I think. So I just wanted to ask you, I guess, a kind of a two-part question because, we have our societies such as they are and they have their flaws. And as you mentioned earlier, most organizations reach a point where they start failing to do what they're intended to do. If you were to try and, so I guess part A, well, which political structure would you choose if you were trying to make the most effective long-term survivable society?
That's an interesting question. I generally really avoid political questions again because I don't want to overshare with my own. Like I prefer framing questions in interesting ways than giving answers. But in this case, I think as decentralized as possible is my general approach to life. I think that if you look at, ecological diversity is way more resistant or resilient than an ecology that has single prey and single predator. One of the reasons that the dinosaurs, coming back to the first interview, we talked about the paleontology. I was never a paleontologist, but obviously I spent a lot of time talking to paleontologists. And one of the reasons that the dinosaurs went extinct from, yes, there was an asteroid that hit the Earth, but that's not the whole explanation. They had also become overly specialized in one dimension. They were basically using size to compete with each other. And because they were basically adapting only on one dimension, they became very non-resilient to an external impact like a meteor. Whereas mammals hadn't specialized so much. They were much more diverse ecologically. They're small ones, bigger ones. There was a frailty to single structures, single systems, any kind of system that totalizes. And so I'm a big fan. I wouldn't call myself an anarchist, but I prefer decisions to be pushed down to the lowest possible level. I mean, whether it's military, you see over and over that military units where they allow platoon level decision making are much more resilient than communist style structures where the general has to approve every drone strike. I mean, you see this in Russia, Ukraine right now. And so I think resilience is a whole interesting conversation there about allostatic load and anti-fragility and how to build resilient systems that are pro-entropic. By pro-entropic, I mean you can have and this can apply to individual human psychology all the way to political systems where you have people or systems that are fragile. They just can't handle any kind of shakeup. You have ones that are resilient, but only in a very narrow way, and they kind of bounce back to their starting point. But then you can have systems that actually thrive in disruption, and they update their modeling all the time based on that disruption and based on those external stressors. And I would call those pro-entropic systems that are actually learning from challenges. And whether it's a human being or a political system, it's the pro-entropic ones that I think thrive the most. So that means you need constant dissent, you need free speech, you need the ability to decouple ideas where you're not just choosing one tribe or the other, you're not left or right, you're kind of picking what works from each side and learning from your mistakes. I mean, we as a society seem incapable of learning from our mistakes. So that's not a straight political answer. It's more of a political philosophy answer. That would be my kind of recipe for the most resilient possible system, is to be pro-entropic. Like when you were talking about the difference between order and chaos, straight order is rigid and that makes it fragile. Straight chaos is just
Destructive, yeah.
destructive. And you can't have one or the other. You need to be able to reach into the chaos, pull it into the order, but have flexibility, have chaotic flexibility within the order. Like these things really have to have both dimensions, and they have to have this constant iteration, constant probabilistic approach to improvement and learning. Now, how you structure that within institutions, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's another challenge, isn't it? Because I think I was looking at one of the two-dimensional political graphs, so not just left, right, but authoritarian versus libertarian as well on the
Yeah.
y-axis. And you realize that pretty much all our politicians lean towards authoritarianism. It's not a surprise because they kind of have to go into the system, right? Because it is a system of authority. Like you say, the more centralized the government becomes, effectively, the more power it wields, the more authority it has. So the more authoritarian it is by definition, even if it's not like a hardcore authoritarian government. And so it is challenging. I completely agree with your views in that, we want like a delocalized small government that's resilient and able to adapt. But everywhere, like here in England as well, we're in Northern England, you see the same thing. They keep localizing all the government structures, and you're like, anyone who's paying attention knows it's going to fail. And like, it's not going to serve. We had a couple inches of snow this year, and because they'd localized authorities regionally, none of the roads were gridded, and it just stayed for like a week, and it was horrible, like slippery sidewalks everywhere because they just didn't bother cleaning it, right? So
Yeah.
it's just like that's just a simple example of the destructiveness of this kind of thing. So yeah, we see that with the empires rising and falling every 200 years. It's almost like clockwork that they just get
Yeah.
so big and then they collapse on themselves. Do you think that that would also give the population the most ability to thrive as well?
Yes. I mean, I think
Seems seems to go hand
I,
in hand,
I
hopefully,
think
but
it goes to hand in hand. There's always a risk. The capitalism, for example, in its original Adam Smith form, which assumed atomistic markets and no corporations big enough to influence the market, which is clearly not what we have now. In the original Adam Smith sense of capitalism, it was extremely decentralized, and it created very adaptive systems. But even in something like that, people do get left behind. It's usually the ones who are less able to compete. So I think by and large, yes, the most people will benefit from the most decentralized system, but there will be always some cost. I mean, everything's a trade-off. There are no right decisions. I forget who I'm quoting now. I'm quoting somebody that there are no right decisions. There are only trade-offs.
I've heard, yeah, Thomas Sowell was one who
Maybe
said
it's
it
Thomas Sowell.
anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, yeah. Thank you. And I'm probably butchering the quote, but that concept. I mean, I think that's a relevant concern. But because these decentralized systems end up growing the pie the most, there should be a way of, when the pie is growing, there should be a way to redistribute to the people who kind of are not as able to benefit from it. At the same time, you don't want that redistribution to kill the growth of the pie. So, I mean, we're getting back into pol- pol-
The
politics
tough,
101.
yeah, tough act. And to do it while an empire is developing is even harder because everyone's just like gung ho for development. And
Yeah.
you have to like balance all this stuff early on for it to function.
I think just generally, if anybody out there is convinced that they have the answer, then it's probably better to doubt them, because
Yeah.
one of the most beautiful things about old school liberals, in my mind, is that they had self doubt. And I think the minute you lose self doubt, you become a kind of a threat.
Yeah.
Everybody should engage in some self doubt.
Yeah, no, that's one of the most interesting things and frightening things that's happened in the modern Western political sphere, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I do think I'm conscious of the time, and I think we're about out of time. So it has been great chatting with you, and thank you for giving me so much of your time today. Before we go, perhaps you could let us know any upcoming books you have, where we might find you online. And I think you're up for an award you can mention as well.
Yeah. Well, before I go there, I just want to say thank you. This was really fun. I really enjoyed that conversation. Just, yeah, I
No,
love good conversations, and this was really, really fun.
no, thank you for the
Yeah.
time today.
No, but for the award, the book has been shortlisted. The Man Who Saw Seconds has been shortlisted for the Locus Award. If you are a Locus magazine subscriber or do vote for the Locus Award, I would encourage everyone to go vote for it who reads science fiction. It's a great list of books. And I mean, I'd love your vote, but just generally, it'd be great to see more people voting for it, because it's the only one of the big three science fiction awards that's open to all readers worldwide. And I think that makes it pretty special. As far as my own stuff, my last name, Boldizar. So my website, I was lucky enough to have a weird last name, so my website is just boldizar.com. And from there, it should connect to all the social media and everything else. And yeah, again, thank you. This is fun.
Alexander Boldizar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.